I'm Bryan Jensen with UW Extension in the Department of Entomology and also with the Integrated Pest Management Program. Today I'll be talking about some of the late season corn insect pests, and by that I mean we'll be talking in order with corn rootworm, western bean cutworm, and also Japanese beetles. The one thing I will not cover are specific insecticide recommendations. If you would like to get those recommendations, you can get our Bulletin, Pest Management in Wisconsin Field Crops, A3646, from the Pesticide Applicator Training Store, and the URL is at the bottom of your screen. Okay, corn rootworms. In Wisconsin, we have two species that are of economic concern. Both adults are about 1/4 of an inch long. The northern is solid green color. It does not have any markings on its back. The western is more of a yellow-green color with black stripes on its back. The larvae for both species look very, very similar, and they will have a tan head, a white to cream-colored body. There are 3 instars, and at full grown they'll be up to close to 3/8 of an inch long. Here's a picture of the western. That's the yellow-green species with the black stripes down the back. The next one is the northern. That's more of a lime green color, but no markings on the back. And also the larvae for both species look very, very similar. Those are fully grown larvae with that tan head. It's important to know a little bit about the corn rootworm life cycle so that we can better understand our management practices and also understand when we do the things that we should be doing, like scouting and things like that. Both species have the same life cycle. There's 1 generation per year. They overwinter only as eggs. Those larvae will hatch early June, maybe late May, depending on the spring weather. The adults will emerge by early July, and they'll be around up until the first frost of the fall. They will, however, start laying eggs in mid-August to early September, and usually, if not most of the time, they will only lay those eggs in the soil of cornfields. Damage from the larvae, they only feed on corn roots. They will not feed on any other crop plants, and the effect is that they reduce the water and nutrient uptake from that plant. And above ground symptoms will be lodging or goosenecking, but do remember there are other causes of lodging. Don't assume that any down corn is a result of rootworm feeding. Here's a couple pictures of feeding. The inset picture on the right is a completely healthy plant. There may be some scarring on the roots, but the larger picture in the middle shows classic rootworm feeding. There's a little bit of scarring right up here on a few of these roots. That is not considered economic, but with corn rootworm feeding, what we're mostly concerned about is any larval pruning of that root to within 1.5 inches of that stalk. So on this root, we can see this whole node is pruned back to within 1.5 inches, as well as this node right here as well. The above ground symptoms. As I mentioned, we call it goosenecking. As the plant starts to fall down, especially with higher winds or wet soil, it continues to try to grow straight up, so we get kind of that goosenecking appearance to the stalk. But remember, not all lodging is from corn rootworm feeding. Many other causes, including stalk rots, compaction, just high winds, wet soil, things like that. Also, the above ground symptoms may look similar to other nutrient deficiencies. In this case is nitrogen deficiency on a corn plant. However, it's not a result of lack of nitrogen in the soil. Rather, it's a result of the rootworm feeding on the roots, and that plant is just not able to pick up the available nitrogen. The adults can damage corn, although that's not all that common. They will feed on green silks. And those fields which tend to have the greatest problem are the early planted fields or the late planted fields. And I say that because although the green silk is very attractive to them, they will move a fair distance to feed on those green silks. They'll also feed on pollen, but there's a lot of corn pollen out there, and that is not economic. The western corn rootworm may feed on the leaves, the northern does not, but that leaf feeding is inconsequential, and I have not seen that ever to be an economic concern. Here's a picture of the adult rootworm feeding on corn silks. You can see in the area up here where those silks have been pruned off and they're falling down on the leaf. What that does is reduce the possibility of those kernels being pollinated, and we can end up with an ear that looks like this picture. I'd mentioned the western corn rootworm will feed on the corn leaves. However, that's not considered economic, and this is just a picture of what that feeding can look like. It's rather severe feeding. You don't typically see it this bad in the field. There's two reasons why we scout for corn rootworm beetles. The first is to predict the need for root protection in continuous corn the following year. We want to do this during that period of time where the adults are laying eggs. And typically in Wisconsin, that will be from, they'll start laying in mid-August and conclude by early September. They'll be out well before that and well after that, but that is a period of time that we want to count the beetles to get a better idea of what the damage could be that following year. To get a good assessment of insect populations at that point in time, we suggest that you go to 10 different areas of the field and count the adult beetles on 5 non-consecutive plants. But count the beetles on the entire plant, on the tassel, on the leaves, as well as those that are feeding on the silk. We would recommend at least 2 to 3 weekly scoutings for beetles. However, if after that first period of time, that first scouting, you are over threshold, which is 3/4 of a beetle per plant, you really wouldn't have to scout that field after that. You've reached a conclusion. You know that that field has to be treated the following year if you're planting back to corn. If, however, you are not above that threshold, then it would be nice, I think, to at least come back one more time just to confirm that beetle populations are low. The other reason that you would scout for adult rootworm feeding is for silk protection, and that is only during that 10-day period of time when the corn is silking, that it has green silk, and count the number of beetles per plant. The threshold is roughly 5 to 6 beetles per plant, but most importantly is that they are clipping the silk. And you would like to see before you treat that the silk is clipped to within a 1/2 inch of the tip of the husk. We do have some unusual management concerns with rootworms. First is the northern corn rootworm. They have a phenomenon that's called extended diapause, meaning that they require 2 chill periods before the eggs hatch. So in a typical corn bean rotation, for those northerns which do not have that extended diapause trait, the eggs will hatch in the soybean year and those larvae will not live. But in a population that has extended diapause, it requires 2 chill periods. So therefore, in a corn bean rotation, that first chill period is followed up by that soybean crop. The second chill period is followed up by corn. Those eggs will hatch and the larvae will feed on the corn roots. That has only been found in Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Iowa. It is, to this point in time, not found in Wisconsin. The western corn rootworm beetle has adapted in some areas of Wisconsin to our corn and soybean rotation by laying eggs in soybeans. That was first found in Wisconsin in 2002 and was a bit of a problem for a while, but recently we have not seen this happening very often. What we have been seeing as of late is resistance by the western corn rootworm to the Bt corn rootworm transgenic hybrids. As I mentioned, it's only the western corn rootworm, As far as we know right now, there is no concern with the northern corn rootworm, but Bt resistance by the western corn rootworm has been found in several states, including Nebraska, Minnesota, Illinois, Michigan, New York, Iowa, and also Wisconsin. However, our cases of Bt resistance have been somewhat isolated, I think in part because beetle populations have been so low in recent years, and also because we have pretty good rotation with other crops in the state of Wisconsin. So these Bt traits are great technology, and I would like to offer some guidelines to slowing the Bt resistance. Overuse can and will lead to resistance, so we want to diversify our management practices. We don't want to rely on just the Bt hybrids to control our rootworm populations. If we do year after year after year without using any other control practices, we will have resistant problems of our own. So field monitoring for corn rootworm beetles and their damage is going to be really important. To follow up with the root damage assessment, to standardize our rating for damage, I would like to suggest that we use the Iowa State Nodal Root Rating System. It's a 0 to 3 scale. The number to the left of the decimal equals the number or equivalent of the number of roots that are pruned back, nodes of roots that are pruned back, I should say. And the number to the right of the decimal is a percentage of that next node of roots that's pruned back. So for example, if we had a root which scored a 1.6, that means that one complete node of roots is pruned back, or the equivalent of one whole new node of roots is pruned back, and 60% of that next node is pruned back. A ballpark threshold for larval feeding is if you have a root rating of greater than a 0.75, that is most likely going to result in some economic damage. If you're less than a root rating of 0.25 on a field average, I do not expect to see any economic damage from rootworm feeding in that situation. If you're in a gray area between a 0.25 and a 0.75, whether you or not you get economic loss will be the result of other factors as well as the rootworm feeding, and that can include drought. It could include fertility problems, disease problems, compaction, things like that. So why take the time to assess our corn rootworm damage? In first year corn, it can tell us whether or not we have confirmation of the extended diapause of the northern corn rootworm, or if we have this rotation resistant western corn rootworm. In continuous corn fields, we can validate the efficacy of our Bt hybrids, in part to find out how well they are working or perhaps not, but also if we're starting to find some root feeding on a Bt hybrid, we can catch that resistance at an early stage and save us some economic loss. Also by evaluating our roots, and typically this will be done in late July, early August, we can look how well some of our other management practices are working, for example, seed treatments, and also how the soil applied insecticides are working. Why scout for beetles? Rootworm populations, like other insects, fluctuate year to year, certainly field to field, and especially in the last 5 years in Wisconsin, the Department of Ag's rootworm survey shows that our beetle populations have been extremely low. In 2017, 2018, they have been the lowest populations on record of the 40-year survey. And it will give you specific field data information that we can use to diversify our management practices. If we have extremely high populations and we have the option to rotate out of corn to soybeans or another crop next year, that may be our best management practices. Also, if populations are high, that may be a field that I would want to choose a BT hybrid, assuming I don't have any resistance issues already. If I've got low to high populations, that might be a situation where I would want to use an at-plant soil applied insecticide. And if I got extremely low populations but above threshold, I might be able to save a fair amount of money and use a high rate of a corn rootworm seed treatment. And certainly, if you were to look at the DATCAP beetle population survey over the last few years, you will see that a lot of the fields do not have high enough populations of rootworms to even use any sort of control practice. With the BT hybrids, you do need to know which BT protein you are using. There are 4 different and specific BT proteins. They are the Yield Guard rootworm protein, the Agrasure RW, Agrasure Duracade, and also the Herculex RW. And behind those trade names, you can see the scientific nomenclature for each of those proteins. It's important to know those because we do, in my last bulletin, we do want to rotate those proteins at least every 2 years, if not rotate them on an annual basis. The more years that we use them in succession is the greater the chance of us getting resistance to that specific trait. There are several different trait packages that are available, and it is kind of difficult to remember which trait package includes which BT proteins, whether it is a below ground protein or one for above ground insects. And finally, with this slide, I will mention that with all of the 4 specific BT proteins that are currently available, we've had some non-performance issues in our state. So again, rotate those BT proteins, use them when needed, don't use them when there are other practices that could fit, and we want to diversify our management practices to protect those BT proteins and keep them available for us. Okay, let's switch to the western bean cutworm. They are a relatively new pest on Wisconsin, in Wisconsin on corn. We first found them in 2005. Potential pest on field corn, sweet corn, popcorn. The literature will suggest they are a problem on dried beans, but we have never seen them be a problem on soybeans in the Midwest. There is 1 generation per year, and the damage potential, especially in 2017 and 2018, has been increasing. Initially, sandier soils had more of a problem with them because the larvae would form a earthen cocoon in the soil, and the sandier soils allowed for better penetration of the larvae, but they have been adapting and have been a problem also on our silt loams. A little bit on the life cycle. There's, as I mentioned, 1 generation per year. The moths emerge in early July, depending on weather. The eggs are laid in cluster on the upper corn leaves. And each cluster may have about 50 eggs per mass, and that may vary from as little as 5 eggs per mass up to maybe 70 or more. But typically there's about 50 eggs per egg mass. They are dome-shaped. When they are first laid, they are white or cream colored. As they mature, they become more of a darker color, almost a purple if not black color. And the significance of knowing that is when they turn that purple or a dark color, they should be hatching within 24, maybe 48 hours. Knowing that can help us time our insecticide applications for first hatch. Once laid, those eggs will take about 5 to 7 days to hatch. The larvae can disperse quite readily from one plant to the next. That is why our economic threshold is so low, and we'll get to that in just a little bit. So they disperse quite easily, moving from one plant to the next, both in the row and across the row, moving on leaf bridges. The newly hatched larvae are more of a dark brown. They will have a black head, and there's just not a lot of good identifying characteristics on either the small larvae or the large one as well. The mature larvae will have two dark colored triangles right behind the head. In this picture we can see those rectangles rather right here. Other than that, there's not a lot for identifying characteristics. They will maybe have a lighter colored band on their back, maybe a darker gray sides, but their head will be kind of a brownish to orange color. Initially, after hatching, the larvae will feed on leaves and pollen, and then they will migrate to the ear and start feeding on that developing ear as soon as that plant reaches R1. To manage Western bean cutworm, I think the most important thing that you can do to get started with is to get a subscription to the Pest Survey Bulletin. That is put out weekly by the Department of Ag during the summer months. It's an excellent first alert bulletin. They have a pheromone trap network for Western bean cutworm. They will report what their trap catches are. They collect data on Wednesday afternoon, maybe Thursday morning, and you will get a copy of that electronic newsletter by Thursday afternoon, usually on Friday. That is an excellent first alert bulletin, and that URL for getting a free subscription to that is on the screen. Typically, eggs will start hatching at about 1350 degree days, and degree days will be included in that pest survey bulletin for several different areas around the state. Initially, I would suggest scouting VT or tasseling corn first. That's going to be the most attractive to the adult females to be laying eggs. Those eggs will be laid on the upper leaf surface and on the upper leaves. Initially, you might think that would make scouting a little bit more difficult because it's hard to see on top of those upper leaves. But if you're scouting on a day where it's sunny, those leaves are backlit by the sun, and you can see the shadow of the eggs on the underside of the leaf. Our economic threshold in field corn is rather low. We suggest treating when 5% of the corn plants are infested. On sweet corn, that threshold is a bit lower at 4% infested plants. A couple of different ways that we can manage for Western bean cutworm. The first is with the use of foliar insecticides. The advantage of that is with scouting, we can best time our treatment for when we do have economic damage. Timing of that application is going to be important. We have a rather long egg laying period, maybe 2 to 3 weeks. Eggs are not going to be susceptible to our insecticide application, and that insecticide application will only last on that leaf, meaning we'll have a lethal concentration on that leaf for about 7 days. So timing can be an issue, and that's why we would suggest timing, if over threshold, when the eggs are just starting to hatch. You're trying to get your biggest return on investment from that insecticide application. The other way that we can manage Western bean cutworm is with the BT hybrids. It can be a bit of an issue, a bit of a concern, because you're buying that hybrid well in advance of knowing if you're going to even have an economic concern with Western bean cutworm. There are several above ground BT traits that are available for above ground insects. The only one that works well is the VIP3A protein. Okay, now let's finish up with Japanese beetles. 2017 and 2018, we've seen rather high beetle populations over a very wide geographical range of Wisconsin, from the southern counties up to the northern counties as well. There's only one generation per year. The adults will emerge middle part of June through early July. There's a rather extended period where the adults are emerging from the soils. Shortly after emergence, within a couple weeks, the females will start laying eggs. Typically, that's going to start about the middle part of July, and they do prefer to lay eggs in moist soil, and that's where we get better survival of the grubs as well after egg hatch. The eggs will hatch in approximately 2 weeks after being laid, and those grubs will feed through the end of the summer and on into the fall. There are 3 different instar stages, and they will reach that 3rd instar by the end of the warmer weather in the summer. And then they overwinter as 3rd instar larvae, and the grubs will feed on grass roots that following spring up until the adults emerge. They'll pupate, and then the adults will emerge as early as the middle part of June. Identification: once you have seen one Japanese beetle, you're going to remember it for the rest of your life. They are rather large, about 1/2 inch long, and it's primarily only the adult that is damaging corn. We've had some situations, not common, when the grubs can't feed on corn roots. However, it's the adults that cause most of the damage to corn. So it's about 1/2 inch long. The head and thorax are a metallic green color. The wing covers are a metallic bronze color, very shiny, very showy. And also, if you look at the side of the abdomen, there on each side of the abdomen, there are 6 white tufts of hair. And their damage to corn: they will feed on corn silks just like the adult corn rootworm beetles will. So they'll clip silks. On average, it's going to take about 3 beetles per plant to cause an economic damage. And you also will want to make sure that they're clipping beetles. Sometimes, whether it's corn rootworm adults or Japanese beetles, they may be on the plant, but they're not feeding on the silk. And if they're not feeding on the silk, they're not causing any economic loss. With Japanese beetles, they tend to feed in pockets, concentrated in pockets, and typically that's going to be on the field edge. So during that Japanese beetle season, when the corn is starting to pollinate and you have green silks out there, I would certainly suggest to keep an eye on at least field edges for any adult feeding that you might see. So that's it for the late season corn insects. We do have several other CCA YouTube training videos on both corn insect and alfalfa pests. Thank you.